Good morning. It's April 13th, and this is To My Liberal Friends. History has a tendency to repeat itself, and I see that happening again today. In the 1930s, Midwestern Republicans refused to enter the war in Europe. To them, this was a European problem, and not something the United States should be concerned about. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the problem of allowing Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich to go unchallenged, and looked for ways for the United States to help those fighting in Europe. Roosevelt developed the Lend-Lease program to assist Great Britain in staving off a Nazi invasion. It took the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, to wake up those who had opposed the United States entering the war and forced them to realize this was a global threat, not just a war in Europe. Their political brand of isolationism would no longer work. Of course, we all know that history tells us that, led by the United States, the Allies were able to defeat both Germany and Japan. The United States then led the rebuilding of these two countries, and they have become valuable allies to the U.S. In 2022, Vladimir Putin had his Russian military invade neighboring Ukraine. Most military experts thought this would be a very short war and that Russia would overrun Ukraine in a matter of weeks. I have to assume some had visions of the German blitzkrieg running through Europe in the early parts of the Second World War. But the Ukrainian people have fought back bravely and defended their nation courageously. And once again, we have conservative Republicans in the Congress sounding like those that existed in the 1930s. They question what is the interest of the United States in defending Ukraine. What they don't understand is Vladimir Putin has no intention of stopping at Ukraine. Just looking at recent history should tell them everything they need to know. In 2014, during the Obama administration, Russia annexed Crimea, every part of Ukraine. The United States stood back and allowed it to happen. Vladimir Putin has dreams of reinventing the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. He dreams of Russian glory. Joe Biden does not escape blame on this matter either. Over and over, he has waffled about sending aid to the Ukrainian people. When they needed air defense systems early in the fight to defend against Russian airstrikes, he was hesitant. When they needed tanks to launch an offensive, he asked the Germans to provide their Leopard tanks while he waffled and hesitated on providing the Abrams tanks. When the Ukrainian government asked for air power, the United States blocked some of our allies from sending military aircraft to the Ukrainians, which would allow them to counter Russian airstrikes. Early on, Joe Biden had sent a signal of how he would act about this Russian incursion. During a long and rambling January 19, 2022 press conference, Joe Biden suggested that Russia would face consequences, but they would be minor if it restrains itself to, quote, a minor incursion, end quote, in Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, the suggestion that an invasion, if properly sized, would draw a slap on the wrist, officials in Kiev were stunned. So too were officials across Europe, as well as many in the U.S. political, foreign policy, and defense establishments. The White House tried to quickly contain the damage, issuing various clarifications on what the president meant to say, deploying senior officials to engage news outlets with the assurance of U.S. support for Ukraine and stern warnings to Russia. This is typical how the White House tries to clean up the mess Joe Biden makes with his verbal gaffes. Eventually, they trotted out the president to read a strongly worded prepared statement, kind of a useful device to minimize the chance he'd go off script again. As someone that is a student of history, I would remind both the Republicans and the White House that small comments and actions have an impact on how the nations perceive us. Way back in 1950, then Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech outlining America's interest in the Asia-Pacific region that included Japan, its island chain extending southward, and the Philippines. It did not mention South Korea, creating the perception that it was not part of any American security guarantees. This is thought to have incentivized North Korea to invade and China to support that action. Just a few months later than that, perceptions of U.S. interest in priorities and policies matter. In 1990, something similar happened when April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, met with Saddam Hussein. According to the Foreign Policy Report, Glaspie told Saddam, "We have no opinion on the Arab conflicts like your border disagreement with Kuwait," end quote. The U.S. State Department had earlier told Saddam that Washington had, quote, no special defense or security commitments to Kuwait, end quote. Hussein interpreted this as an opportunity to annex Kuwait. He invaded in August 1990, sparking the Gulf War in early 1991. No matter how you feel about the war going in Ukraine, you should realize that it has an effect on the United States and how our allies view us. The perception of America as divided, distracted, and sophomoric in its interests and behaviors, or disinterested in or detached from the realities that bear upon NATO allies of our friends in the Pacific, Taiwan for example, cannot but cause allies to question America's resolve, its willingness to stand against aggression, its competence in doing so, and for competitors to believe there is opportunity to achieve their objectives, no longer having to be concerned about a vigorous, effective U.S. response. There's an old saying, quote, better to be silent and thought to be a fool than to speak and remove all doubt, end quote. Something these conservative Republicans and Joe Biden should consider. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe and recommend to your friends.